Things got a little bit heated between Dr. Fauci and Senator Rand Paul during a coronavirus hearing on Wednesday. Let's take a look.
Dr. Fauci, today you said you are not for economic lockdown, yet your mitigation recommendations from dating to baseball to restaurants to movie theaters have led to this economic lockdown. Do you have any second thoughts about your mitigation recommendations, considering the evidence that despite all of the things we've done in the U.S., our death rate is essentially worse than Sweden, equivalent to the less developed world that is unable to do any of the things that you've been promoting? Do you have any second thoughts? Are you willing to look at the data that countries that did very little actually have a lower death rate than the United States?
All right, so that was Rand Paul. Now, about 3 minutes before that, he spent a lot of time doing a gish gallop, basically. So he threw out a bunch of information, some of which was not cited. For example, he claimed that without lockdowns, the same number of people would have died. There's no evidence to back that up. He also threw in loaded language, like, for example, calling efforts to fight the pandemic as quote-unquote authoritarian. He also kept using Sweden as an example while downplaying Japan and South Korea. He did address it, but again, downplayed those countries and their efforts to fight the coronavirus. Japan, by the way, look, Japan and South Korea, they're generally, the population seems to be a bit more community-oriented as far as like caring about the nation and their fellow citizens. And so they tend to put that over their personal stuff, like quote-unquote personal freedom. They're also used to wearing masks. You see a lot of mask wearing in those countries. And so as a result, they didn't necessarily, at least in Japan, require the government to put out special rules, right? Strict rules. In the case of Japan, they actually didn't have the authority. But in South Korea, they did put in some strict rules. But Rand Paul uses the example of Sweden because what his overall goal is to open up the country without reducing the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. So now, look, I want to reopen the economy, of course, but as most of us do. But I'm willing to wait until it's safe enough to do so. And that's ultimately what all of us want. We want to have a better handle on the virus so that we can go out and we can go out safely without having to worry about transmitting the virus to people like our grandmothers, grandfathers, relatives with, with like immunocompromised systems, and all that, right? So we just want to do that, and we can achieve that by wearing masks, social distancing, contact tracing, and of course, vaccination once a safe and effective vaccine is available. Rand Paul, however, Rand Paul's lazy. So the reason I say that is because Rand Paul and the rest of the Republicans don't want to do the hard work. They don't want to do any of that. What they want to do is just take the easy way out and say, I don't know, let's just all go back to normal and let herd immunity take care of it, right? So that means, of course, no lockdowns. We're just going to allow everyone to be infected. And that'll work out. For whom? I mean, you do even the most simple math, and you come out with the potential of millions of people dying in this country. Remember, the death rate of just 1%, right? With a death rate of 1%, over 3 million Americans would die if everyone in this country were infected. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen, but herd immunity basically says that if you reach a certain threshold, for example, let's say 70% of the population has the antibodies, then that means that essentially the virus has a very hard time of spreading, right? Because, they're not as infectious. The body fights it off. You've got the antibodies and all that stuff. And you're immune essentially to it, to being reinfected, and then you won't be able to spread it, and the virus kind of dies off. So now, even that, right, you would see with 70%, you would still see, to get to that point, around 2 million people dying. Remember, out of the 7 million people known to be infected in the country, you've got over 200,000 people that have died. You do the math on that, and death rate is nearly 3%. You expand that out to the entire population, or even most of the population, then you would have at a 2.86% death rate, which we currently have now. That's nearly 8 million people. So that, no matter what you do and what factors that you put in, just by the pure numbers, you're going to see at least a few million people dead. And that's not to mention, of course, long-term damage to people who've gotten the virus, people that are, the long haulers, for example. And there is also conflicting evidence whether or not people stay immune for long enough for this to happen. And so, look, this virus, I don't think that you can just really herd immunity away without having a massive, massive death toll. And so, nonetheless, Dr. Fauci, he's going to talk about this, and he's basically going to call bullshit on Rand Paul using Sweden as an example because, well, just watch.
Senator, I'd be happy at a different time to sit down and go over detail. You've said a lot of different things. You've compared us to Sweden, and there are a lot of differences. And you said, well, there are a lot of differences between Sweden, but compare Sweden's death rate to other comparable Scandinavian countries. It's worse. So I don't think it's appropriate to compare Sweden with us. I don't regret saying that the only way we could have really stopped the explosion of infection was by essentially, I want to say shutting down, I mean essentially having the physical separation and the kinds of recommendations that we've made.
All right, so look, basically, let's talk about Sweden, right? So that's the discussion that Rand Paul wants to have. All right. Well, Rand Paul said, well, the government, look, we didn't need to do this lockdown. The government in Sweden didn't do this lockdown. So, okay. But as a result, more people in Sweden died comparative to the other countries, okay, who had more stricter lockdowns. So already the data contradicts what Rand Paul was, the point that Rand Paul was trying to make is that, well, the people the countries that locked down, we've got the same death rate. And then, of course, they compare it to America. But see, again, that's the problem. They're not comparable. And so there's a factor here that really undercuts Rand Paul's argument. See, in Sweden, and this doesn't get mentioned a lot of people actually voluntarily isolated. They did work from home when possible. Over 80% of Swedes reported doing and adhering to social distancing measures. Although, of course, there have been large gatherings of tourists and generally younger men who didn't seem to follow the guidelines as much, and that's, of course, why you seen a lot of this stuff pop up. So 80%. I do not think that it would be that high in America. And again, in Sweden, they had a gigantic spike, and then they had a fall off, right? So the question is, well, Republicans, conservatives will look at that and be like, well, see, it worked. You had the gigantic spike, over half of which happened in nursing homes and things like that. But look, they're doing pretty good. They must have herd immunity, right? Well, right now, it's basically estimated that around 6% of the population of Sweden, and this was in July, these are July's numbers, were known to have the antibodies. Now, again, we don't know necessarily how long those antibodies last, how long that people are actually immune, or if they can get reinfected. There's still a lot that we don't know about the virus. But there are experts in Sweden that say, well, look, it actually might be higher, to be fair. And this is according to the Swedish Public Health Agency. But basically, what I'm trying to say is that Sweden did things that we in America, I don't think we're going to do. Widespread testing, for example, contact tracing, and isolation. And again, they still had, as a result of lax measures, a higher death rate than the countries that had more strict measures and weren't as voluntary. And so now the Republican plan, by the way, and this is really the difference, the Republican plan doesn't involve widespread testing, contact tracing, or anything like that. It just means open everything up and act like everything is normal. Well, wait a minute. That's not what Sweden did. We would actually do even worse than that if we were to enact a Republican plan. And again, Donald Trump doesn't want widespread testing. He needs to slow the testing down. People like Rand Paul are against contact tracing because government overreach, and many Republicans aren't interested at all in voluntarily socially distancing or wearing their masks. And so the Swedish approach, not going to work here because people are not going to voluntarily do that. It's going to end up killing a great many more people per capita because people would, without a mandate, just choose not to participate. We wouldn't even see the height. I would say probably around 60% of people in America would do the voluntary actions, whereas because you've already seen it in a lot of areas, a lot of people not doing any of the stuff, social distancing or wearing masks or anything like that. And so there's some problems with that. It would be, I think, an absolute disaster. However, Rand Paul, he is not done with this. He's going to continue to try to make the argument against doing any of these measures, and he's going to try to bring up New York as an example. Take a look.
You've been a big fan of Cuomo and the shutdown in New York. You've lauded New York for their policy. New York had the highest death rate in the world. How could we possibly be jumping up and down and saying, oh, Governor Cuomo did a great job? He had the worst death rate in the world.
No, you misconstrued that, Senator, and you've done that repetitively in the past. They got hit very badly. They've made some mistakes. Right now, if you look at what's going on right now, the things that are going on in New York to get their test positivity 1% or less is because they are looking at the guidelines that we have put together from the task force of the 4 or 5 things of masks, social distancing, outdoors more than indoors, avoiding crowds, and washing hands.
Or they've developed enough community immunity that they're no longer having the pandemic because they have enough immunity in New York City to actually stop.
I challenge that, Senator, because I want to, please, sir, I would like to be able to do this because this happens with Senator Rand all the time. You were not listening to what the director of the CDC said, that in New York it's about 22%. If you believe 22% is herd immunity, I believe you're alone in that.
22%. So that would be a rather low threshold for herd immunity. But here's the thing. Do you think that Rand Paul cares about that? Do you think he even knows about that? I know, but you understand, Rand Paul's not a doctor, he's an optometrist. He also is going up against Dr. Fauci, who is an immunologist and a virologist. And so he actually knows a bit more. So just because, well, I mean, they both are doctors. Oh, okay, but that's saying that, like a doctor, for example, a general practitioner is skilled enough to do brain surgery. That's not at all true. Or even a cardiac surgeon would do great at brain surgery. No, they're not the same thing. They're specializations. And so Dr. Fauci's specialization is viruses. And so he kind of knows what he's doing. And I know I've got some people talking about how, oh, it's just for the money-sucking vaccines. It's actually really, really cheap to create vaccines, and most of them are free. Now, look, I have done stories about how there are private corporations that want to charge an arm and a leg for a vaccine. And so that's, if you want to make that point, that corporate greed is getting in the way of people being vaccinated, that's fair. But and that's actually going to be a good point. And I've made that point before. But how exactly would Fauci himself benefit from corporations? Is he a CEO? Is he a shareholder? It doesn't seem like there seems to be a link there. Really strange. But look, here's the thing. As I said, Sweden did what they did, and there were a lot of people that ended up paying the price. Now, we're not sure what the long-term impacts would be because we don't know enough about the virus. It may turn out that maybe it did work. Maybe there is a lower threshold. But at the same time, we're not exactly Sweden. In America, we're different. We have a different culture. We have an incredibly individualistic culture. And I don't think Americans, it's not that I think that we're too stupid to do things right. No, stupidity doesn't have anything to do with it. I think there's selfishness and stubbornness that gets in the way. So people don't want to mask up voluntarily. They don't want to socially distance. They don't want to avoid large gatherings or work from home from possible. And there are millions of people who won't do that. And we couldn't even achieve a herd immunity, I think, with so many of those people who are so individualistic that they refuse to do any of the measures that Swedes voluntarily have done in their country to slow the pandemic. And not only that, but Japanese have also voluntarily done these measures to try to slow and stop the pandemic. I don't think Americans will do that. I just don't think we're going to do that. And so with a population as large as America, we're going to potentially see millions of people. And all for what? So that people can eat it at Applebee's again inside? I don't really think that's a good trade-off. I don't think it's worth it. There's a lot of economic devastation, and that really does concern me. I am very, very worried about that. But at the same time, again, because millions of people are struggling, right? At the same time, why are we making a false choice out of, well, we're just going to have to sacrifice millions of people to COVID so that millions others can go and actually be able to eat it in Applebee's again and work and all that stuff. That's a false choice. There are measures that we can take to slow the virus so that we can actually begin to reopen the economy and do it in a way that protects the most vulnerable. And there are ways that the government can, support the American people, which they have not. They have supported corporations. They have supported the wealthy. They've supported the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, all over the American people, making it really, really difficult for people to do the right thing. They even killed a plan by the post office to hand out free masks. And the president has not been a leader on saying that we should socially distance or mask up because of purely political reasons. And so this is a problem, okay? Look, it's about personal responsibility. And Republicans love to say that a lot. But I think in this case it is. You are taking personal responsibility for yourself and other people around you when you socially distance, wash your hands, and put on a mask and wear a mask in a store. That is personal responsibility. Maybe instead of acting like a baby and throwing a fit because you have to put on a mask instead of a gas station, suck it up, be an adult, and actually just wear the goddamn mask. And that's it. It's not that hard. Do your responsibility as not only do your responsibility as an American and mask up and do what you have to do. The sooner you do that, the sooner we can all go to Applebee's. Because guess what? That would mean we actually work together as Americans to defeat this virus. Will that happen? Probably not. Being honest with you. But that said, you can't say that we didn't warn you when the death toll will continue to exponentially rise come this winter. Winter is coming. And it's going to bring a lot of death with it, unfortunately.